What's up, class? So this week we have is this week's reading and video is kind of short. It's on technology and innovation. Very important. Okay, so the transition to sound at the end of the 1920s initiated a transformation in basic motion picture technology that extended beyond the unique innovation of sound itself. The sound revolution set into motion a series of other experiments that ultimately would lead to the second major technological revolution in the 1950s, the introduction of widescreen. Um, the introduction of widescreen movies filmed in color and recorded in stereophonic magnetic sound. Okay. The transition to sound took place in less than 4 years, but shifted to widescreen and color as the new standards for production and exhibition. So, the widescreen format, how can I explain it? It's just something you have to see. Widescreen is what we usually see, like at the IMAX. That would be something comparable. Um, but the screen is actually much wider. The transition to sound took place in less than 4 years, but the shift to widescreen and color didn't occur for over 20 years. So the widescreen revolution had already failed by the end of 1930, and color filmmaking, which found use in only a handful of films each year, emerged during the 1930s and 1940s as a minor variation to the norm of black and white. The concept of spectacle and presentation informs the experimentation that takes place with new technology other than sound. Widescreen and large screen projections of the period regularly drew upon sensational alterations in image size. So they were stretching the image to fit this wide screen. Thus, Abel Gance's Napoleon, which was particularly filmed in Polyvision, expands its climactic moments of the narrative from one screen to 3 screens projection, tripling the width of the projected image. At around the same time, Paramount's experimentation with a new projection process called Magnascope. And Magnascope involved the use of a special wide-angle projection lens which magnified the image, blowing it up from the projection from a standard 15 by 20 foot screen to an overwhelming 30 by 40 foot screen. Okay, skipping forward here, we know about color. Another technological invention that came across was the zoom lens. It's very important. Sensationalism, I'm on page 263. Sensationalism also governed the usage of the first zoom lens, which appeared in the transition to sound period in films such as It in 1927 and The Four Feathers. The zoom, or varifocal lens, possesses the ability to move through a variety of different focal lengths from a wide angle to a telephoto range. So what does that mean? And why did that impact film? So to go from a wide to a telephoto means you can go from a wide shot, which was what people had been used to in the early formation of film. Remember, we stuck with the wide shot. But now we have the ability to go from the wide and zoom in really close without moving the camera. That was the significance of that. So in terms of storytelling, you can really bring people into the action. Like I can zoom from a wide shot and then zoom into someone's face to capture the emotion or their reaction. Okay. Another one was deep focus. The chief technological innovation during the 1930s was the development of deep focus. Deep focus involves the expansion of depth of field, resulting in an image that maintains sharp focus from the objects in the extreme foreground to those in the distant background. So what that means is like depth of field is the range at which a lens can focus on properly. And anything that's out of a certain depth will become soft or out of focus, essentially. So now we have this depth of focus cinematography that's popping up. At the same time, deep focus was achieved by filming with extremely wide-angle lenses whose aperture had been stopped down. This sort of cinematography was made possible by a variety of developments in related fields of film technology. So these different experimentations have brought about aperture control, being able to step down on film. Very technical thing. You don't have to know this for the class or for the test or anything, but it's interesting to know that these separate inventions or developments were brought about this one depth of focus. So at the same time, improvements in the speed of black and white film stock made it possible to secure adequate exposure with a smaller lens aperture. So with a smaller lens aperture, the aperture is what lets light come in to the camera and expose the film to the image. So if you have a smaller aperture, you're getting in less light. Well, the older film stocks need a lot of light. So with less light that these new lenses they're using, they had to develop a new film stock to match. And these developments were not confined to the United States. You had German manufacturers like Agfa and Ansco. You had Eastman Kodak. So there were different companies, different countries tackling these different problems. As with other technologies, deep focus traces its origins back to the earlier periods. Lumiere's actualities of the 1890s possessed tremendous depth of field. These and other films which were shot in exterior took advantage of relatively short focal length lenses and abundant sunlight to produce deep images. Moving on to the 1950s, widescreen and stereo. So, by the 1930s, the film industry had created basically a habitual movie-going audience. And so because they had this habitual movie-going audience, they terminated a lot of the technological experimentation. There was no demand for it, and exhibitors wanted to keep their costs low. So there was no reason to invest in new projection equipment or 3D, widescreen, or other stuff that was going on at this time. Okay? So in 1948, the average weekly attendance at a motion picture in the United States stood at 90 million, an all-time high. By 1952, this dropped to 51 million, largely as a result of domestic shift of a percentage of the U.S. population from cities where major theaters were located to the suburbs. American movie pictures industries responded to these new patterns by providing more participatory forms of entertainment, which modeled in part on concepts of presence associated with the legitimate theater. So they're looking at new concepts now of entertainment that are more associated with live entertainment. they're looking for picture technologies that would involve the spectator in the on-screen action. Thus, Cinerama Dome, introduced in September 1952, informed its audience that you won't be gazing at a movie screen. You'll find yourself swept right into the picture, surrounded by sight and sound. So now they're developing larger pictures to the widescreen format, Cinerama, to give another enhanced feeling as if you were there in the picture, swept away into it. Cinerama was developed outside the film industry by a Long Island inventor named Fred Waller, and he achieved its remarkable sense of participation by filling the spectator's field, the peripheral field, our side vision, and encompasses an angle of view that's 146 degrees wide and 55 degrees tall. So he expanded off to the side how much we see, and expanded upwards how much we see the picture playing. The sound was recorded magnetically with from 5 to 6 microphones and played back by a sound-controlled engineer through 7 speakers in the theater. So you got this surround sound kind of experience going on. The first Cinerama feature was called This Is Cinerama, and it was made in 1952, and it grossed over $32 million, even though it played at only a handful of theaters. And the reason why it only played at a handful of theaters is because a lot of theater owners, remember, were reluctant to upgrade because you needed specific equipment and a specific size screen to be able to play Cinerama films. The success of 3D was even more short-lived than Cinerama. It only lasted about 18 months. From late 1952 to the spring of 1954, in 1950s, 3D relied upon the Polaroid filters rather than an anaglyphic format. CinemaScope was introduced by the 20th Century Fox, and it attempted to imitate or duplicate Cinerama, and streamlining it for film production in the film industry as a whole. The cornerstone of the CinemaScope system was called the anamorphic lens. And this lens basically it compresses the image, and then what you do is when you project it, it uncompresses it, so to speak. So, CinemaScope quickly became an industry standard, and by the end of 1954, every studio except for Paramount, which had developed its own widescreen process known as VistaVision, had adapted to CinemaScope format. And by 1958, 85% of all U.S. and Canadian theaters had been equipped to show CinemaScope films. Whew. That's a large chunk of theaters. So it's almost as if you're planning on showing your movie, which you are, which you want to play it as many places as possible. It would behoove you at the time to shoot it in CinemaScope. Okay. In closing, the various production and exhibition technologies introduced in the 1950s constitutes a revolution of sorts in the nature of movie-going experiences. The audiences were initially overwhelmed by the widescreen images and colors, which were projected on large curved screens and accompanied by multi-track stereo magnetic sounds. If the cinema can be said to have begun as a novelty with the peep show like the kinetoscope, and with the projection of moving images on large theater screens for mass audiences, then the explosion of novel technologies in the 1950s almost amounts to the reinvention of cinema. So the widescreen and audio had, and the lenses and depth of field, all those inventions reinvented cinema in the 1950s. All right, I'll see you guys on the next video next week.